The left have been on a bad run recently. Donald Trump, Brexit, Boris Johnson, Viktor Orban, they just keep losing, time after time. Despite the fact that, as they never tire of reminding us, they're far more decent and intelligent than their political opposition. So why this run of bad luck? Well, let's look at the evidence. In the 2015 UK general election, the left largely tarred their opponents as idiots and racists. And they lost. In the Brexit referendum of 2016, the left, and it was largely the left who favoured Remain, again tarred their rivals as idiots and racists. And again they lost. That vote was particularly instructive. 17 million people voted for Brexit. It was the single biggest mandate in British electoral history. Yet that vast number of people were subjected to crass generalisations and gross insinuations by a left who continue bragging about their tolerance and their intellectual probity. In the US general election that same year, the Democrats screamed that Trump supporters were idiots and racists, or, in Hillary's lovely term, the deplorables. They lost. And in the 2017 UK general election, the left screamed that their rivals were idiots and racists once more. And they lost, once more. At this point, you would hope the left might stop and take stock of what's going on, might think of approaching elections with a more positive form of campaigning, one that recognises people's concerns and looks at ways to address them. Instead, in the 2019 EU elections, they decided to label all their opponents as idiots and racists, and to dump milkshakes on them as well. They were then mystified when this mature approach saw them drubbed at the polls by the Brexit Party. And where have we seen this tactic before? Oh, yes. Nice company you're keeping. The 2019 UK general election that followed just 4 months later was particularly instructive. On one side, we had Corbynism, a party that clearly despised Britain, that couldn't conceal their distaste for the working classes, an organisation mired in anti-Semitism, wedded to idiotic financial lunacies that have proven disastrous countless times before. A group who had spent years sticking up for the likes of ISIS, Hamas, the IRA, Al-Qaeda, Russia, Mao, Castro, Venezuela and Stalin, but who had never once spoken up in defence of the democratic West. Their party also seemed determined to overthrow the single biggest mandate in British history. Their campaign targeted sneering hatred at businessmen and landlords, while their supporters screamed that their rivals were idiots and racists, even while denying, covering up and excusing the far worse racism in their own ranks. And on the other hand, you had Boris Johnson, an administration that clearly loved Britain deeply, that was optimistic about the future, that hoped to regenerate the working class areas that had been suffering recently, and that was absolutely committed to enacting the democratic will of the people. We had, in essence, an entirely negative campaign versus an entirely positive campaign, whatever has happened since then. That was why Boris Johnson won. Not because Rupert Murdoch brainwashed the plebs. But why did Labour say that they lost? It was because their manifesto was too complicated for the working classes to understand. That's right. They legitimately said that they lost because their voters were thick. And racist, obviously. What's even more remarkable about this losing run is that the cultural reach of the left and their stranglehold on our institutions dwarfs that of their rivals. The majority of the media leans left. The BBC is left-wing. The internet giants are all left-wing. Hollywood is left-wing. The theatre is left-wing. The music industry is left-wing. The comedy circuit is left-wing. Our education system and universities are left-wing. And leftist dogma has even saturated the corporate world. Yet despite this incredible cultural dominance, they're still managing to alienate the electorate by focusing on a hectoring, sneering, accusative, and lecturing style of politics that crassly insults the values and identities of the bulk of the electorate. Now, by this point, we really should start to wonder who the thick ones really are. I hasten to add that I'm not making any wild generalizations that the left are stupid. They're not, and I'm not a bigot. But if you're going to advertise yourself on your decency and on your intellectual superiority, then it might be advisable to start studying past trends and to stop being so unpleasant, because that's not the best way to win support. Just a tip. I'm sure you'll ignore it. Because what's happening is that arrogant, unpleasant, and abusive people are losing time after time after time. Yet they're remaining completely bewildered as to why it's happening. Now, there's an election imminent in America, and events had been turning in the left's favour. Donald Trump had campaigned on fiscal responsibility, but with his administration's poor handling of the coronavirus and the resultant collapse of the American economy, his chances had begun unravelling. If his opposition had just left him to it, his presidency may very well have collapsed. But with an election pending, how did the left decide to behave? Like savages, frankly. They have torn numerous American cities apart. They're attacking the concept of the US itself. They are desecrating American art and history, and they are setting urban areas on fire and killing numerous innocents. And all of this has been the greatest political gift to Donald Trump imaginable, because the American electorate now have a straight choice. Do they want to vote for the party that has pledged to stand up to these vandals, to protect US institutions? Or do they want to vote for the party who is supporting the rioters, who have literally taken a knee to the mob? I'd imagine that for many Americans, that would be quite a simple choice. Now, I'm not going to predict who'll win this election. I lean towards Trump because his campaign is largely positive, while his opponent's is largely negative. But I feel it's on a knife edge. Yet there are some outcomes I feel I can predict with a fair degree of confidence. This will be a remarkably violent election, perhaps the most violent in US history. The majority of that violence will come from the left, and if they lose, they will blame everybody for their defeat but themselves, and they will refuse to accept responsibility for their own abominable behaviour. Then they will riot again. They will continue rioting for some time, and they will damn everybody else as idiots and racists.